So growing up, my dad was my coach. He was my pastor, and he was my dad. And I had a really hard time distinguishing between the three. He was really hard on me as a coach because he wanted me to be great. He had high expectations of me as a boy because he was a pastor, and he had been taught that if I do right and I live the life that, he set out before me, and as a pastor that, I would have a good relationship with God. And then as a dad, it really wasn't there. It was, I knew him as a coach and a pastor. And not that he tried to do that. But, it's either we're on the baseball field or the football field or practicing in the front yard, or we're at church and we're at home and he's talking to me about God. And so the whole dad aspect was very minute, a very small percentage of like how I even knew him. He was an amazing man. He still is an amazing man. But I had a ton of father wounds. And what I've come to understand is how I saw him is how I saw God. I thought my dad was what God looked like. And you can't put that expectation on anyone. No one can be God. No one is perfect. And, what I've learned is he was raised up in a system that was very fearful. And not only that, but he was very underfathered. My grandpa is awesome, but my grandpa underfathered him. Every man in my dad's life has let him down that have been really important to him. And so in an attempt to make that right, he overfathered me because he wanted what was best for me. And he wanted what little Byron would have wanted for little JB. And how generationally that works is when you're underfathered, it swings to the other side of the pendulum and you begin to overfather. Both are rooted in the same thing, which is a need inside of us that only God can fill. And so a lot of us deal with these type of things, whether you're underfathered or overfathered and undermothered and overmothered. But there's a happy medium of that comes with true healing and true restoration. And so, for me, this past year has been a walking through that with my dad, being able to finally be real with him, being able to show him who I really am, being able to be honest with him, being able to accept him for who he is and realize that he's not perfect and the things that shaped him. And so, who is my father? He's an amazing man that is wounded like all of us, and we're all in a restoration process, but he's human, just like me. It had a huge effect because I am a pastor's kid. And so when your dad is someone in the church that people look up to as a spiritual leader, you think of them as closer to God than you. You think of them, and it's not the right way to think of it, but I thought of it in a way of like, my dad is here, and here's God, and then here's me down here. And so instead of going after God's affirmation, I went after my dad's. And he had never been truly affirmed himself. And he was giving me the affirmation that he needed when he was my age, but it wasn't the affirmation that I needed when I was his age. And so I began to see God as a coach. I began to see God as quick-tempered. I began to see God as all about what I do. If I can do this and please him, he'll be happy with me. And that truly affected my relationship with God for years. And the thing is like, I would hear over and over and over and over in church sermons, like, God loves you, he's gracious. But deep down in me, I didn't believe it because there was deep wounding. And so the healing that came from it, I believe everything happens for a reason. And I believe that trauma and generational trauma is passed down until someone decides enough. And when you choose to stop the trauma, not only are you choosing to stop the trauma, but you're also choosing to be introduced to who God truly is. It's both spiritual and physical. And so what happened was, I went to rehab. And because I was taking drugs, because I was trying to bandage something that was broken. And a lot of that stemmed from me and my dad, a lot of it. And the first thing that they told me was, forget everything you know about God. And that was a scary thing because even though it's not that even though I didn't really see God the way he was, it had become comfortable to me to like expect what I expected. It like this pain, this hurt. It's like the devil that you know. When you leave the devil that you don't know what you're going to get. And so there was this fear in me to forget everything I knew about God because I felt guilty about it. I felt like this was something that I was doing that would make God mad, because if I forget this God that I know, he's not going to accept me. But I knew I had to forget the God that I knew because it had got me to this place. And so I forgot the God I knew. And I said, I want to know what true relationship is with you. And so I said, God, I have a ton of questions. I don't think that I know you like I thought I did. I'm a pastor. My dad's a pastor. I grew up in church, but I don't think I really know who you are. And I'd like to rediscover you and know you. And through a lot of pain and through a lot of bringing things from the subconscious up to the conscious and speaking and getting things out of me, and therapy and prayer and surrender, and not only that, but giving the God I didn't know my mustard seed, that mustard seed of faith, he began to answer and he began to restore 1,000-fold. And I finally felt what true love was. There's a quote, and the quote is, when you're not fed love off of a silver spoon, you begin to lick it off of a knife. And for so long, I was chasing the affirmation of God through other men because of my relationship with my dad. And I always would end up cut and wounded and with a sour taste in my mouth. But finally, when I rediscovered him, I understood what it was to be fed love with a silver spoon, the grace. But not only that I could love and trust myself because he loves me. And so not only did I get to know God, but I got to know me. And from that, I got to know my earthly dad, which was, it's like completely full circle. So that was the healing that came from it. Yeah. So what really helped me in understanding what it means to be a child of God is, this is kind of an illustration. And this came to my head months back. If I was a father and I had a son or a daughter, and I looked at that son, and every day he or she woke up and they were full of shame. They didn't trust themselves. They didn't think that they were good enough. They weren't confident. They didn't feel like they could hear my voice because they were tortured. If I were a dad and that were my kid, I would not be pleased. Not only not be pleased, but I would be extremely sad. And that's how I lived for 26 years, was that little boy, because I wasn't sure of me. Then I thought, if I were a dad, if I were a father, and my son wasn't afraid to make a mistake, he raised some hell, he was confident in himself, he knew his father's voice because he realized how close his father was to him. He wasn't full of fear because he knew his father would always accept him and have grace for him. He knew that his father would open the doors that he was supposed to walk through. He lived life with confidence because he knew he could trust his father. That would be how I would want to father my son. That would be the son that I would say, he's got it. And so for me, what it was a form of understanding I have to love myself. I have to be confident in myself because God chose me. In the Bible, it says, God says, I am the vine, you are the branch. So what that means is God possesses me. I am literally an external piece of God. Doesn't mean I am God. It means he created me to partner with me. And if he created me to partner with me, then that means I must be pretty special. So when I realized that, I said, I'm going to be confident. I'm going to be myself. I'm going to raise some hell. I might do things and say things that I probably will regret, but God will convict me. And I know that he'll still love me, and I'll ask for forgiveness. I'm not going to be perfect. And I'm going to know that because he's so close to me, my intuition, my gut, that is God speaking to me. Like when I know what gives me peace, I know it's him. When I know what gives me fear, I know it's not him. And so I've become more confident in knowing who I am because I know who he is. And that is what shaped it all for me, is I won't be that little kid that questions everything and questions myself anymore. Because that kid doesn't know who he is and he doesn't know his father. I'm going to be the kid that trusts his father, knows his voice, and is confident in himself and his father. So, yeah. So, I'm sure we've all been through seasons where we pray and pray and pray and pray, and nothing happens. There's a verse that says, faith without works is dead. And the reason I say that is because there's a quote that I love, and it's, if I do the natural, God will do the supernatural. And when we think of the natural, sometimes we think of doing things that is also God's job, and that is not our job. So I want to tell you a story. So when I went to rehab, I was there for 60 days. I left all my problems at home. They weren't gone. I didn't have a phone. I couldn't contact my wife, my family, full of fear. On top of that, rehab was $60,000. I made $60,000 in a year. I didn't have that. Like, I have rent. I have paying for my wife, paying for me, paying for food. On top of that, things were bad with my wife and I. Things were really bad with my dad and I and my mom and I and my brothers, and there was no restoration at all with our family. And it tortured me. The finances tortured me, and the fact that I wouldn't have my family back tortured me. Like, I had messed up too bad. And the thing is, I had messed up too bad. And one night, I was being tortured by fear, like freaking out. Like, what am I going to do? And God had to take me out of my environment, and I had no way of having any control. I didn't have a phone. I couldn't text old boy down the road and say, yo, can I borrow 60 grand? Like it wasn't that, or, make a group text or a GoFundMe. Like I couldn't call my wife and try to apologize and tell her it won't happen again. I literally had to trust God. And he said, why don't every time you feel this way, every time you get this thought, out loud, surrender it to me. And bro, when I tell you that I surrendered it hundreds of times in a day, I would go on walks, just so much anxiety, because when you're in those dark places, it's like there is no light. And I would get the thought, the first thing that I went at was the finances, because I knew I was going to be there a long time. I knew the whole family thing would come together at some point, but I couldn't even talk to them at this point, but I could pray about the finances. And the Bible says, be anxious for nothing. Instead, pray. And prayer isn't saying like, God, please, no, prayer is saying, God, I trust that you're going to take care of this. And you say to cast my burdens on you, so I'm going to cast my burdens on you. So that's what I did. I would surrender it 5 times in a minute, because I'd say it, I'd feel okay for a second, and then the thought would come back and the feeling would come back, and I'd say, God, I don't have the energy to do this. You know my need. You know the financial situation. I need you to take care of this. Over and over and over and over. And that was me giving him my mustard seed, because I barely had any belief at that point, because I'd been beat down, or I'd beat myself down too. And after a few days, I wasn't surrendering it as much, because the feelings, I started to feel peace with no answers yet. And then a couple weeks go by, I'm still surrendering it, and they call me in and say, hey, your insurance is still covering the payment, which is weird, but once it stops covering it, we're going to put you on scholarship. All of rehab paid for right there. And I said, holy crap. Like, I didn't do anything, but I did do the natural. And what the natural is for me was giving up control and not running from my pain, but surrendering my pain. That's what compassion is. Jesus says he has compassion for us. Compassion is walking with us through the pain. And a lot of times, instead of letting God have compassion, we run from the pain and we medicate and we try and control scenarios when really we have no control. Okay, so that was number one. And that mustard seed began to then crack my whole foundation, and this new faith. I had this new understanding of faith and who my father was. Well, the next thing was, are you going to restore my family? And week 8 at rehab, I'd been there for, 50 something days. We had family week, family therapy, 3 days straight of intense family therapy. Well, we're not in a good place. Like, they just dropped me off at rehab. I put my wife through hell, lied to my parents, all of it. So I said, God, if you answered the finances, then you're going to have to do this with my family. So I said, I'm going to do the natural. Every time I get worried, I'm going to surrender it to you. On top of that, in group therapy and when they're here, I'm going to be honest, I'm going to give effort, and I'm going to go first. I'm going to do only what I can do. I'm going to be the first to go in every group therapy session. I'm going to be a man, and I'm going to own up, and I'm going to ask for forgiveness, and I'm not going to be a victim, and I'm not going to blame. And you're going to have to do what you do. Those are 3 hard days of a lot of pain and a lot of tears and a lot of questions, a lot of fingers pointing at me. But I had brought myself there, and I had to accept it. At the end of that family week, the restoration that took place was something that I could have never dreamt up. Restoration with me and my wife and my mom, my wife and my dad and my mom, my brothers and my parents, my brothers, and like, it was like intertangled into like every single facet of our family history. and our family dynamic. And in my head, a good outcome would have been me and my wife are on a good page and me and my dad are on a good page, because that's how small we think. But God said, no, let me just go ahead and restore all of it. When that happened and that became known, I said, God, I know who you are now. I've discovered you. I know that when I do the natural, you'll do the supernatural, because you love me. You want what's best for me, and it might not look how I want it to look, but it's going to look better than I ever thought it would. And that might mean I have to walk through some pain and some uncomfortable days and nights, but I'll always surrender it to you from here on out. And then months later, every single thing from leaving my job to finances, like he answers over and above every single time, because my hands aren't on it. I surrender it, and I do the natural. And the natural is little, but his job is the 95%. I got the 5%. So, yeah, man. Second Corinthians 11:3 says, do not be deceived like the serpent deceived Eve. Do not let your minds be led astray of the simplicity and the purity with the walk with me. And what he's saying is, I'll make it simple for you. And when he talks about purity, he's talking about childlikeness. So what I urge you to do is try and connect with the little you. And there's 3 things that you can do. Number 1, say, God, I need your help. I want to know you as a father. And all of this stuff is going on right now around me, and I don't know what to do. Ask him for help. Number 2, be aware. Because once you ask for help, he's going to open the door that you never could have opened. And you got to walk through that door, and it might be uncomfortable. Kind of like when I asked for help and he opened the door of rehab. That's like the last place I wanted to go. Or it might be another type of door. It might be therapy. It might be a new church. It might be a new group. It might be coaching. Ask for help. Be aware. And then number 3 is be honest and give effort. And if you do those 3 things, things don't happen overnight, but there will be a process of restoration and a process of you understanding who your father really is. And at the end of it, you're not going to really know what happened, but you're going to know that you asked for help and that you walked through that open door and that you were honest. And that's the only thing that you can tell others is God did this. And if he did it for me, the most orphan-minded person ever, he'll do it for you.